On his jail cell floor. New details show the breakdown of oversight in the jail that left him unattended.
The victims deserve justice.
And closing arguments in the trial of the man accused of being at the center of the kidnapping, rape, and murder of a college couple.
He started it. He was there at the beginning. He was there throughout.
The defense says prosecutors failed to connect the dots to their client.
The state's case is a lot of speculation.
Plus, life in prison or the death penalty for the Florida man convicted of killing his parents and brother after they cut him off from a Bulgarian webcam girl.
Plain and simple, 2019 has been a tragic year.
The Daily Debrief recaps the nation's biggest legal stories. It's Monday, August 12th. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Daily Debrief. I'm Jesse Weber, in for Aaron Keller, joined on set by attorney Michel Bryant. Lot to discuss. Let's break it all down. Details and new questions are emerging about the apparent suicide of accused pedophile and multimillionaire Jeffrey Epstein. He was found dead on his cell floor Saturday morning. Breakdowns in procedure at the jail he was being held at are at the center. First, the Wall Street Journal is reporting that Epstein was taken off of suicide watch at the request of his lawyers. Second, guards should have checked on him every 30 minutes, but that didn't happen. According to the Washington Post, Epstein had not been checked on for several hours before he was found dead. Third, his cellmate was transferred for unclear reasons the day before his death. So Epstein was all alone. Finally, media outlets are reporting that the jail was only 70% staffed and that a guard on Epstein's unit was working his 5th straight day of mandatory overtime. The New York Medical Examiner conducted an autopsy over the weekend, but said that more information would be needed to determine the cause of death. In a speech today, Attorney General Bill Barr expressed his frustration with the correctional facility, which is a part of his own Justice Department.
I was appalled, and indeed the whole department was, and frankly, angry, to learn of the MCC's failure to adequately secure this prisoner. But let me assure you that this case will continue on against anyone who was complicit with Epstein. Any co-conspirators should not rest easy. The victims deserve justice, and they will get it.
Law&Crime's legal expert and former Department of Justice prosecutor Gene Rossi called Epstein's death disgraceful for the justice system and for Epstein's victims.
There are probably about 5 to 10 people in Maine Justice, including the Attorney General, who are getting weekly updates, if not daily updates, on the equivalent of El Chapo. Jeffrey Epstein was El Chapo, period. And they were monitoring everything that was going on in that jail. Now, do I think that somebody killed Jeffrey Epstein? No. But I think they gave him the opportunity to take his life by recklessness, deliberate ignorance, willful blindness, and heads have to roll. This is disgraceful, not only for the justice system, for the hundreds of victims, not 10, not 20. There are hundreds of victims who need justice.
While we know Gene's perspective, let's get the perspective of Michel Bryant. So, Michael, what is the difference, or what is the line between skepticism and conspiracy here?
Boy, I mean, we don't know enough, and we know just enough to dream up all kinds of conspiracy theories. I do think that if he did commit suicide, that it was facilitated by folks who maybe thought it would be better if he did commit suicide. It's almost like saying, hey, don't ask for permission, just say you're sorry after the fact. All these folks that controlled where he was, who was watching him, whether he had a cellmate, whether he was on the suicide watch, for them to step back and let this happen, if that's what was done, it was a lot easier to just say, oh, sorry, we screwed up. We didn't have enough bodies to cover the shift we should have. Sorry.
Yeah, whether it's ruled foul play or a suicide, it appears that other people will be held responsible.
I would hope so.
And look, this is the big development, too, that Epstein's lawyers, they've hired forensic pathologist Michael Baden, who is the husband of Law&Crime's very own Linda Kenny Baden, to do an independent investigation, an independent autopsy. What does that tell you?
Yeah, good move. I mean, in any high-profile case, we've seen that. We've seen it with Anna Nicole Smith, with her son Danny Smith. It's just a way to protect the family and the process, really. I'm not sure anybody in Epstein's family is crying over his death. I don't even know much about the family. Does anybody? But the fact is, the process needs to be looked over. If anything else we've learned in this last few days is somebody's not watching the candy store there. Something's wrong. So to have Bodden overlook the autopsy and that investigation, smart.
Look, people are frustrated and people want answers. I mean, this was the end of an investigation. I guess the question is, where does it move now? Does it move to other players like Ghislaine Maxwell, his alleged co-conspirator?
You know, all along that name has been talked about, but never really insinuated as one of the players.
Right.
I think that's where they got to go if they're following that criminal track.
Well, we're going to follow it ourselves. A lot to talk about there, but let's switch gears. Jury deliberations, they began today after powerful closing arguments in a chilling case out of Tennessee. Eric Boyd faces life in prison if convicted in the deaths of 21-year-old Shannon Christian and 23-year-old Christopher Newsom. Both victims were beaten, raped, and murdered. Newsom was shot 3 times, then his body doused in gasoline and set on fire. Christian is believed to have been held captive for 24 hours, repeatedly sexually assaulted, then stuffed inside of a trash can to suffocate. Boyd claims he just wasn't involved with the vicious murders. Now, 4 other co-defendants have already been convicted in the case, with sentences ranging from 35 years in prison to the death penalty. One co-defendant, George Thomas, took the stand against Boyd, and he did that in exchange for his 2 life sentences being reduced to 50 years. In their closing, the prosecution argued that the jury should in fact believe what Thomas said, and that his claims were backed up by other evidence.
It's been 4,600 days since these crimes happened. 4,595 days is how long it's been since George Thomas told Sheriff Hutchison that this defendant marched Chris Newsom into that house on 23. We couldn't use that as long as Mr. Thomas is charged. We can't put Mr. Thomas's statement in against Mr. Boyd until Mr. Thomas gave us permission to do that. And that's why Mr. Thomas was here, to give you a couple more pieces of this puzzle, if you will. He answered questions from Mr. Frazier and from the state without hesitation. And as Sheriff Jones, former Sheriff Jones told you, he did the same thing 12 years ago when he interviewed. Now, I'm not embracing Mr. Thomas whatsoever. He's a convicted murderer, okay? But I suggest to you, when he testified under oath, and same oath y'all did, that you have the right to believe the key elements of his testimony. Did he tell us it? Did he hold back? Sure, he's still holding back. We know that. I'm not going to say he's not. But the key subject matters of his testimony had been corroborated by these other witnesses.
When it was their turn, the defense argued that the prosecution's case was mere speculation and that Thomas, the state's star witness, was not credible at all.
Again, the state has proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Lamarcus Davidson, LaTalvis Cobbins, Vanessa Coleman, and George Thomas were responsible for these murders. What about the case against Eric Boyd? And at the end of it, there is no physical evidence that ties Eric Boyd to the rape, to the murder, to the thefts, or to the robberies. The state's case is a lot of speculation. What do we know about Mr. Thomas? Well, we know that he and LaTalvis Cobbins are best friends. We know that he and LaTalvis were present during the abductions, rapes, and murders, and that after the crimes were committed, they fled to Kentucky. We know that in Kentucky, they're caught with Shannon's property. When they talk to the police, both implicate Eric Boyd, but neither Lamarcus nor Vanessa Coleman implicate him. Again, he's loyal to LaTalvis. He doesn't know Eric Boyd. He doesn't know him. He's loyal, so loyal to him that he doesn't even directly implicate LaTalvis in the crimes that took place at 2316 Chipman Street. Even when he testified the other day, he didn't implicate his best friend.
All right, let's go back to George Thomas's testimony. He pointed the finger at Boyd for the death of victim Christopher Newsom and made himself out to be just a passive observer of this entire gruesome attack.
What did you see Mr. Boyd do? he got out of the SUV and opened the back door and grabbed Mr. Newsom, and they walked towards the drainage ditch area.
What are you doing?
I'm sitting beside the front seat, just looking.
What happens after that?
Kind of pulled him over towards that way. Well, walked him over that way. Then I seen 3 bright, shots basically.
So when you saw the 3 flashes, who did you see pulling Mr. Newsom?
Mr. Boyd.
What happened after he pulled Mr. Newsom to that location?
He came back and grabbed the can of gas.
Who did that?
Mr. Boyd.
So what happens after you see him get the gas?
He goes back towards the area where he had pulled Mr. Newsom, and that's when, a couple of minutes later, I seen a bright whoosh.
On cross-examination, the defense first focused on how Thomas's story has changed about who was there when Newsom died and how that story has changed in a way that benefits the prosecution.
Testified yesterday that Chris Newsom wasn't taken off by Eric Boyd and LaMarcus Davison, which is at least one of the statements that you made in Kentucky, right?
Correct.
I think you also said in Kentucky that Eric Boyd took Mr. Newsom off by himself, correct?
Correct.
Yesterday you testified that in fact you and Eric Boyd took Mr. Newsom off.
Correct.
Mr. Thomas, isn't it true that you decided to blame Eric Boyd for the crimes that you committed?
No.
You didn't care what happened to Eric Boyd.
Oh, you asked me did I care what happened to him?
I'm saying you didn't care, did you?
I didn't know him, so.
You didn't know? Okay. Just like you didn't care what happened to Shannon Christian.
I don't see how those two would relate to say that I didn't care about them. I mean, I didn't know them either.
Yeah. Just like when you said, "F that white girl," she didn't mean anything to me. You said that, didn't you?
I didn't say that specifically like that. That statement was taken out of context by Detective Norman.
Another key piece of evidence is the white Pontiac, which prosecutors say puts Boyd at the scene of the crime. Let's go through the testimony in the car because it got a little complicated. Adrienne Mathis, the defendant's cousin, she testified in previous trials that she lent Boyd a white Pontiac. But in this trial, she said she couldn't recall. Xavier Jenkins told police shortly after the crime that he saw the victim's forerunner outside the house where the crime occurred. 9 months later, he came back to police and he said he saw a white car as well. And George Thomas, the co-defendant we've talked a lot about, he said Eric Boyd showed up to the crime driving a white Pontiac. All right, so let's break this all down. Now, Michael, is George Thomas just a couple of pieces, as the prosecution said, or is he their entire case?
It's scary, but I think he's the big thing for them. I think he's the reason they decided to now go after Mr. Boyd. I started thinking about that when the case started. Why now? Why Eric Boyd now? What's changed? If this is what's changed, this is a bad case. I mean, I don't see the prosecution carrying their burden if this guy is the star.
Let me ask you this. If the jury doesn't believe him, does the jury have enough to convict? You heard about the white Pontiac. Is the white Pontiac enough? Is the DNA on the gun holster enough?
It gives them something. And let's face it, this case is so outrageous and so the victim's so horrible and the victim's family members that sympathy could overcome all the holes that the prosecution may have in its case. And that includes this guy on the stand, Thomas. It also includes the Adrienne, the cousin who didn't remember her own name and had to have some of her testimony read back from the federal crimes tried earlier. That's probably something for the jury to handle, and it could be enough because the case is so outrageous.
I mean, we're waiting for a verdict, Ren, but the question is, when can we expect a verdict in a case like this? Jury began deliberations today.
Yeah, you know, they've had it, I think about 3 hours they've been at it. Not a horribly long time. There are 36 counts they've got to wade through. That's going to give them something to do, even if they come up with the wrong answer without the evidence. It's going to take a while.
We'll wait and see.
Yep.
We'll wait and see. Still ahead tonight on the debrief, the beginning of the penalty phase for a man who murdered his family in cold blood. The jury will have to decide whether to recommend the death penalty for Grant Amato, a man who the state says stole money from his family to give to a webcam girl on a porn website. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody. The jury began hearing evidence today to determine whether Grant Amato will spend the rest of his life in prison or be executed for murdering his parents and brother. Prosecutors say Amato became obsessed with a Bulgarian cam girl and sent her $200,000 of his parents' money. When his parents intervened and tried to shut down the relationship, prosecutors say Grant Amato murdered his family. The prosecution gave their opening statement, laying out the aggravating factors they believe will prove Amato deserves the death penalty.
Grant Amato was previously convicted of a capital felony. With respect to each conviction for first-degree premeditated murder, you are allowed to consider the other two convictions of first-degree premeditated murder as a previous conviction for a capital felony. The next aggravating factor that the prosecution is relying upon is what is called the cold, calculated, and premeditated. Basically, the premeditation is exactly as the judge described it during the first part of the trial, with an additional requirement, namely that there's a heightened level of premeditation. The judge will also explain to you what a pretense of moral or legal justification is. Remember, the aggravating factor is that the murder was committed in a cold, calculated, or premeditated manner without any pretense of moral or legal justification. I'm going to talk about that also, what a pretense of moral or legal justification is. And you'll see in this case there is absolutely none.
The defense claimed the prosecution was distorting the meaning of previous capital crimes and that the murders were a crime of passion, not cold, calculated, or premeditated.
When you hear the term has been previously convicted of a violent offense, you're naturally thinking, is there something back in Mr. Amato's background, some previous violent felony before we all came together in this courtroom to decide this case? And the fact of the matter is that there's not. There are no prior violent acts in Mr. Amato's past. Now, when it comes to the cold, calculated, and premeditated aggravator, I don't have to produce any evidence in order to fight that one. I'll use the state of Florida's own evidence against them. He said that my client, Grant Amato, was obsessed with Sylvie, consumed by Sylvie. And what you will hear in my closing arguments are that crimes of passion, crimes of rage are not cold or calculated or premeditated.
Jason Amato, who lost essentially his entire family, his parents and brother are dead, and his brother is convicted of killing them, he took the stand to read an emotional victim impact statement.
I cannot give an exact number of how many people have felt the loss in my family, but there were hundreds of people at their funeral. The minister that led the service told me in his 50 years he has never seen a funeral with 3 caskets. It has been very hard to devote reflection to either my father, mother, or brother. As I start to think of one, it's hard to not think of the others. There are so many memories, stories, and special times that I will never forget. However, I will never be able to make new ones. The toughest thing in all this is how it continues to affect my girls, especially the kids. Christina misses the stories and comfort my family gave, particularly my mom, who always made her feel like a daughter. There are certain things Christina adored about my mom. She could light up a room with her smile and go with the flow personality. Our daughters, they're troubled daily, nightmares, depression, confusion, fear, and having to live lives in the public eye. They miss the days at the barn with my mom, who taught them both how to ride. There are numerous occasions I can think of, but to get to the real question, or how this has affected me, plain and simple, 2019 has been a tragic year.
Now, instead of cross-examining Jason Amato, The defense called him as their own witness, where they asked him one question. Take a listen.
Despite everything that's happened and all the loss that you've suffered and everything, do you love your brother, Grant Amato?
Yes.
Okay. I have no other questions.
Wow, just heartbreaking. Now, the defense, they brought out a psychologist who testified that Amato would be a good inmate if he spent the rest of his life in prison.
I don't believe that he possesses any of the historical or behavioral characteristics that would suggest that he's likely to be violent or to present major management problems for the institution and staff. I also think that in addition to that, there's a good likelihood that he could be productive and well-behaved inmate should he be given life.
All right, let's break this down back with Michel Bryant. Here's the part that I'm confused about. Isn't the defense seemingly conceding that this was a crime of passion at drastic odds with what they did in the trial phase by saying, he didn't do this, he didn't kill them? So how am I supposed to reconcile that? It's the same jury.
It is so odd. They're asking the jury to say, okay, remember when we said he didn't do it? Okay, well, never mind that. It was passion if you believe that he did it, and we respect your verdict. That's the only way they can do that without looking at odds with what they brought on in the liability or the guilt phase.
But doesn't that hurt their chances of an appeal? Because at an appeal, they have the whole record there, and they're one point saying he didn't do it, and then saying he did it, but it was a crime of passion?
Well, I think they have to acknowledge the jury verdict, and I think on appeal that's understood, that you have to take the circumstances you've been given, change, audibilize, and then say, okay, this was a crime of passion, which I also believe is bunk. I think that's a crazy argument to make when there's no passion between. If he killed the Bulgarian girl, that would be a crime of passion. Somebody that did him wrong, something spur of the moment, but not when you lay in wait for your mom, your dad, and your kid.
Let me ask you this: do you think the jury is going to consider, and they have a lot to consider here, if they decide to execute him, that they're taking another family member away from Jason Amato?
Yeah, this is a very tough decision for this jury to figure out, because they're helping eradicate one more Amato, and now here's Jason with absolutely nothing in his life. So is that brother, that Grant Amato, the better brother to have than a former brother, dead brother? I don't know. I'm not sure which is better for Jason. It's not good either way. As he said, it's the worst 2019 ever.
It's a terrible case, terrible year for him, and maybe they'll consider him as a good inmate and sentence him to life in prison. Who knows? Michel Bryant, thanks so much for coming on the debrief and breaking it all down. I appreciate it. All right, everybody. Thank you to all of you for joining us tonight on the debrief. Our live trial coverage resumes tomorrow at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Law&Crime Network. The debrief is live on Law&Crime at 5 o'clock Eastern tomorrow. Good night. We'll see you tomorrow.